Today began much like any other day. I woke up, got dressed, and went down to the kitchen to make and then eat breakfast. I didn't shower because I've always been a night showerer, since it helps me to fall asleep. Although, I don't think any number of showers would be enough to let me sleep tonight. It might be that after what I experienced today, I will never sleep again. Even when I close my eyes now, the sight of what I saw just a few hours ago is burned into the inside of my eyelids, so that when I close my eyes, I still see it, even now, hours later. After eating my breakfast, I showered and got dressed and then left for my work. I'm not going to go into my personal life, but suffice it to say that my job necessitates that I be traveling all the time. On this particular day, I needed to drive 3.5 hours to a city outside my home state to go watch a baseball game with a rich client. The traffic was awful on the drive there, some of the worst I'd ever seen. I spent no less than 2 hours of that trip at an absolute standstill, not moving while I waited in gridlock for traffic to move. By the time I arrived at the baseball stadium, it was only 15 minutes until the game started, and I was desperate to find parking. If I didn't find someplace to park my car, and fast, I was going to be late to the meeting with my client, and that might mean waving goodbye to my job. Of course, I set off in my car to look for a parking garage. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have just abandoned my car in the middle of the street. I'm sure it would have gotten towed, and I would have maybe gotten in trouble with the police. But that would have been far better than what actually happened. Instead, like an idiot, I went driving along the streets, scanning for a parking garage. Any parking garage. The price didn't matter at all. I would have paid $100 or even $1,000 for that space. That's when I saw it. There on the right. There was a driveway sloping down into the ground, disappearing into a yawning darkness. Above the opening, a crude sign had been hung, the letters written in still fresh human blood. Corpse-filled underground parking garage. If I had been in less of a hurry, those words might have given me pause, along with the multitude of human skulls that were hanging from the ceiling with piano wire. But, truth be told, I took little interest in either, beyond thinking that it all seemed a bit unprofessional. I turned on my right turn signal and turned into the dark tunnel. It was easy enough at first, easier even than I would have expected. There was a gate a short distance into the tunnel, but it was already raised, so I simply drove past. A man's corpse had been skewered on the raised bar, blood still dripping from the hole in his chest, but I steered a little to the side so that the blood wouldn't get on my car. When I turned into the main room of the parking garage, I quickly understood where it had gotten its name. The concrete floor was stuffed to the brim with human corpses. Torn apart bodies were strewn across the floor, splattered onto the walls, and hung from the ceiling by meat hooks. There were corpses in many of the cars as well, their hands on their steering wheels, and their gaunt faces open as though in screams of absolute terror. The worst part of all, however, was the way that they were parked. You see, many of the cars were parked diagonally so that they took up 2 spaces. It was terribly sloppy parking, and as I rolled through the blood and the viscera, I felt a deep knot deep in the very pit of my stomach. There would have been easily enough room for me if so many of the drivers hadn't been double parked like that, but I was starting to get worried. I drove through one row of spots and then another, turning on my wipers to clear away the blood dripping onto my windshield. My hands were cold and so sweaty that the wheel kept slipping from my grasp. It was only 6 minutes until the game started, and I knew it was no longer possible for me to be on time, but if I was lucky, I might just manage to be there before my tardiness started really annoying my client. Just then, I let loose a huge sigh of relief, a smile returning to my face. On the far wall at the end of the very last row of cars, I saw free space. Saved. I drove toward it, tearing up with relief a little bit at the sight of it. However, as I approached the space, my breath caught tightly in my throat and a deep knot formed deep in the very pit of my stomach. You see, Most of the spaces in the garage were normal side-by-side spaces, so that each car was to the left or the right of the other cars. But there at the end of the row, there was a single line of spaces where the cars were oriented bumper to bumper. It was one of those spaces, second from the end, that was the only one free. I was going to have to parallel park. Darkness seemed to push in on my vision, and I struggled to maintain consciousness. A deep knot was forming deep in the very pit of my stomach. My eyes bugged out of my skull until I almost thought they would explode. Who the hell had designed this place? They clearly knew that parking spaces could be oriented side by side, since that's what they'd done everywhere else. My heart pounding, I pulled up to the side of the empty space. In front, there was a rusted Lamborghini, so marked with age that I would have thought it was centuries old. Behind me, there was some sort of war chariot parked, the skeletons of 2 horses harnessed at the front. I wiped the sweat dripping from my brow. I didn't have time to waste taking this slow, but I also couldn't afford to scratch or ding such expensive-looking vehicles. I pulled forward a bit, and then began my parallel park. The process felt simultaneously way too fast and way too slow. I twisted my wheel one direction, then rolled backwards a bit, and then twisted it the other direction and kept going. At any moment, I was convinced I would hear the lurch of my rear bumper connecting with the chariot behind me, or the scraping of my front against the back of the Lambo. Neither happened, but there was no time for me to feel relieved. As the car rolled back into proper alignment, I saw with horror that I wasn't actually in the space at all. Instead, my car was nearly 2 feet to the side, partially blocking the path through the garage. But how? I was certain that I had nailed the parallel park. I glanced at the clock. It was 2 minutes until the game started. Now, even if I hurried, I'd still be 10 minutes late. I needed to finish this up immediately, but I also couldn't just leave my car this badly parked. So I switched into drive and pulled out to try again. Again and again I tried, my breathing growing shallower, my lip quivering with ever greater intensity. It wouldn't work. No matter how many times I restarted, I couldn't quite find room between the 2 vehicles to park. Instead, I always wound up at least 1.5 feet to the side, or without room to straighten out the car. It was 2 minutes after the starting pitch, and I was quickly melting down into an absolute panic. The fact that every corpse in the room suddenly turned towards me and laughed in unison only made it more difficult to concentrate than ever. Clenching my fists, I gritted my teeth and gave up. Although my car could barely be considered parked, it was so far outside the lines, I locked the car and sprinted across the garage. I ended up being almost 20 minutes late to the game, and my boss, who was already chatting with the important client, ended up chewing me out in front of that client, lecturing me on the importance of punctuality. It was all I could do to keep myself from breaking out crying in front of both of them. Frankly, this would have been a nightmare all on its own. But my story doesn't end there. After the game, I staggered, defeated and deflated, back to the corpse-filled underground parking garage. It was much the same as I had left it a few hours earlier, other than a few dozen new corpses that had been hung from the ceiling near the entrance while I was gone. When I returned to my car, however, I felt a deep knot forming deep in the very pit of my stomach. You see, the chariot that had been parked behind me was gone. And now, a long, sharp scratch ran along the exposed side of my car. Numb with horror, and with a deep knot forming deep in the very pit of my stomach, I picked up a bit of papyrus that someone had left on my blood-stained windshield. It was written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, but fortunately I studied the language back in college, and so I could read it easily enough. Sorry about damaging your horseless chariot. I can't afford my insurance to know that I've been in another accident, so I'm just going to leave some money. I hope it will be enough for your repairs. On the windshield, I also found a pile of gold coins in some unknown currency. With a little internet research once I arrived home, I discovered that although the coins are worth quite a bit, I'm likely to get arrested for theft or smuggling if I ever try to sell them, since they are protected artifacts from Egypt. In other words, if I'm going to get this car fixed, I'm going to have to play ball with my own insurance or pay out of pocket. I don't know if you drive for your work, but if you do, and you find yourself in a hurry for any reason, and you see a sign written in blood showing the entrance to a corpse-filled underground parking garage, you might be tempted to pull in. All I can say is, don't. Some places weren't really meant for human beings to park.